Good morning, everybody, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this coming weekend, and it's the feast of Corpus Christi, otherwise known as the feast of the body and blood of Christ. It's the day in which we acknowledge the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the presence of Christ under the appearance of bread and wine, which obviously we receive at communion time of Mass, and then also, of course, the presence of Christ in the static presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which is reserved in the church tabernacle. And maybe a starting point with regard to belief in the Eucharist is with regard to the whole question of food and the desire of God to, in a sense, nurture and to nourish people. And for example, in the Old Testament, the first reading for Sunday is from the book of Deuteronomy, and chapter 8, and it's really about the journeying of the people of Israel out of Egypt on their way to the Promised Land. And basically, we're told is that they're in the desert for 40 years, and it was pretty awful with scorpions and snakes and all kinds of stuff. And needless to say, in the desert there's no food either. So during that time, we remember that it's manna from heaven, food from the heavens came down from the heavens and sustained them during that time. Then when you move on to in the New Testament, and in particular to the Gospels, you find that eating seemed to be very much to the fore, especially with regard to Jesus. You find him several times at a meal. In fact, in the Gospel of St. Luke, it's often said that he was either going to a meal, he was at a meal, or he was leaving a meal. And you find in several times, of course, in the Gospels, you have stories of stories whereby people are fed. People are fed with. By people who are listening to Jesus, and all of a sudden they have no food, and he takes care of their need. And you find that especially at the beginning of chapter 6 of St. John's Gospel, where there are 5,000 people there, not counting women and children. And at the end of the day, they had no place to go. There wasn't a 7-Eleven around the corner or anything like that. So anyhow, Jesus ended up. All they had there that they could find was a couple of barley loaves and fish. And what we discover, of course, is that Jesus fed all those people with a few barley loaves, and afterwards there were plenty left over. So, of course, the actual what we call with regard to the Eucharist, or the celebration of Passover, where Jesus assembled with his disciples, and it was a Passover meal, and it was in that meal context that he established the Eucharist, whereby again he took bread and he said, "This is my body," and then the wine, "Take and drink. This is my blood." So you could say, in a sense, that paschal meal, the Passover meal, that is the first Eucharist. So then you go back to the New Testament. You ask yourself, well, what do you find with regard to that event? What do you find in the Gospels? Well, you find, first of all, in three of the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have what we call an institution narrative. That is, you have an account of that Last Supper, where, and from one to the other, they just vary a little bit in how it's described. But all three of them have an account of the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. You don't find that in John's Gospel. The fourth instance of the institution of the Eucharist you actually find in chapter 11 of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and in that Paul he sort of describes the people coming together in a very unworthy way to receive the Eucharist. And he tells us, besides mentioning the actual institution narrative, he also sort of chastises the people for in a sense not really appreciating what it is, and he says that before you receive the Eucharist, that you need to examine yourself and make sure that you are right with the Lord. And then after that, with regard to as I say, John's Gospel doesn't have an institution narrative. But what you have in John's Gospel instead is you've got what we call, where the others have the institution of the Eucharist, he has what we call the washing of the feet, wherein they were assembled actually for his last farewell, and it's in that context that he took a towel and a basin and he washed the feet of the disciples. And as I say, that seems to be done in lieu of the establishment of the Eucharist. And I think it's a reminder that the Eucharist is really about feet washing. It's about service. That the reason why we receive the Eucharist at all is that we go out and make a difference. We're being sent out into the world in order to proclaim and to witness to the presence of Christ under the appearance of bread and wine. Anyway, with regard to sort of a document that sort of that enlarges on the Eucharist in the Gospels, I think the appropriate place is again is chapter 6 of St. John, which is often referred to as John's favorite Eucharistic discount. And as I mentioned already, it starts off with the multiplication, with the feeding where he feeds 5,000. And after he'd done so, he's afraid that the people will try to make him a king by force. So he takes off to the other side of the lake, and eventually they catch up with him. And when they catch up with him, he says to them, "You don't labor now because you have seen the sign, really understood what I've done. Rather, the reason why you're following me is because you were hungry and you got fed." And he goes on from that point to talk about the Eucharist. And he talks about the Eucharist as labor not, he says, for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to life everlasting. And then further on in that same chapter 6, you have it here I have it here in front of me. You're going to have it as the reading on Sunday. It says, Jesus said to the crowds, "I am," he says, "the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever, and the bread that I give is my flesh for the life of the world." And we're told that the Jews quarreled among themselves, saying, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" He says, whereupon Jesus says, "Amen, amen, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will have no life in you. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day." And he goes on in that vein, and then the people who were there listening to this, including some of his close followers, said, "This is a hard saying. How can anyone believe it? How can anyone believe that Jesus makes himself present under the appearance of bread and wine in the Eucharist?" So they were told that they grumbled, and not alone did they grumble, that they actually walked away and said, "This is a hard saying. How can anybody believe it?" And at that stage, then, it's the very end of chapter 6, which you will not find here for Sunday, but you can look it up in the Gospel. But after the people walked away, Jesus turned to Peter and the other disciples. He said, "What about you?" He says, "Are you going to walk away?" And Peter responded for the group. He says, "To whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. We've come to believe that what you say is really true." So that's really puts a nice ending, if you will, to the fact that they express their belief in what Jesus had actually done. So hopefully that'll help you a little bit to a better feel for this great feast which we celebrate here on Sunday, because obviously the Eucharist is, for Catholics, it's in many ways it's what distinguishes us from other Christian denominations. We believe in what we call the real presence of Christ. It's not a symbol, rather that he is truly present. He is truly there under the appearance of bread and wine. So when we gather on Sunday, let us gather to receive the Eucharist and also to truly acknowledge that he is present under the appearance of bread and wine. Thank you.